The acts depicted in this week's film documentary are unsettling to observe, not just the humiliating and surreptitious deprivation of human decency in either the experimental reenactment or its grisly real-life counterpart. Perhaps more disturbing, at least, in the context of our study of ethics and morality, is the languid and seemingly uncompassionate justifications taking place on the legislative side of things, in order to facilitate that which had already begun occurring in Guantanamo Bay. A myriad of attempts were made to rationalize the use of torture and inhumane interrogation techniques, as well as mass revisions to the legal definitions of terms and techniques that were to be implemented in the name of national security, unto individuals who had been stripped of their status as prisoners of war, as well as any rights that might otherwise apply to them under their circumstances. The primary justification for such brass disregard of the humanity of so many people was the importance to the protection of national security. In essence, the acts that had taken place inside of the confines of Guantanamo Bay had been undertaken by the military and the US government in order to protect the American way of life. A simplified rendition of this attempt at justification is the Machiavellian perspective that is, the ends justify the means. This view is expressed in Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, wherein he states that it is crucial to uphold one's own appearance, even to the extent of taking action that might be antithetical to that appearance of character, in order to protect and promote one's own favorable appearance. Machiavelli's historical importance is only relevant to our discussion of ethics, in that he was well known as an outspoken challenger of traditional, ethical, and political frameworks, such as that of Plato and Aristotle, as well as his writings in The Prince, which he challenges the idealistic morality that had been associated with positions of power. The following explanation is from an article amid Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy. For Machiavelli, there is no moral basis on which to judge the difference between legitimate and illegitimate uses of power. Rather, authority and power are essentially co-equal. Whoever has power has the right to command. But goodness does not ensure power, and the good person has no more authority by virtue of being good. The very phrase, the ends justify the means, aside from being associated with and consistent with philosophical ideas of Machiavellianism, is plainly germane to the rationalization of actions and problematic use of authoritative power presented in the issue of torture at Guantanamo Bay, and its subsequent acceptance by the US government. Furthermore, the ends versus the means position reflects the viewpoint of utilitarianism, and that an act's justification is to be found in the consequences that it offers. No action is more or less desirable, save for the consequences that it may have. Central to utilitarianism is the consideration of the consequences for our actions. In doing, one must choose the acts which will give rise to the best or most desirable consequences for the greatest number of people. Ideally, this means that an act would benefit all those that it affects, or failing that, if an action must cause harm, then the act ought to benefit the largest number of people. In deciding whether or not this ethical framework is capable of morally justifying the act of torture for the benefit of the greater good, or for the good of the greatest number of people, it is required to analyze the facts in terms of their potential for furthering moral duties or obligations. Did the good apprehended by the harm caused by the tortures endured by prisoners at Guantanamo Bay outweigh their suffering? While it's difficult to say definitively whether or not some greater harm was avoided by these actions, it is equally difficult to assert that no alternative action could have avoided a greater deal of pain for those captive, while still arriving at a similarly beneficial consequence for the rest of us. Many of the punishments endured at Guantanamo Bay were apparently arbitrary and cruel beyond the extent that was necessary to provide a specific result, and an alternative that foregoes so much unnecessary trauma should have been arrived at under the circumstances present at the time. In other words, I don't believe that the entirety of the actions at Guantanamo Bay were strictly required to produce the best consequences for our people, or that humiliating and cruel treatment was ever required in order to protect the American way of life, as was proffered by our government in response to the controversy. The use of authoritative power at Guantanamo Bay was derelict of moral virtues or obligations, such as compassion, tolerance, and the avoidance of harm. But the example of Guantanamo Bay is an extreme one, and its failure to align with moral virtuousness and destruction of humanity as its chief function does not entirely debase the utilitarian idea that in some instances the needs of the few outweigh that of the many, and that in such circumstances the ends may very well justify the means. Do the ethical failures of Guantanamo Bay and the moral shortcoming implicit with the idea of torture imply that the US should never engage in torture for any reason? Of course, it cannot be fair to say that no circumstances might justify such actions as have occurred in Guantanamo Bay. Indeed, it is possible for even something as debased in ethics as torture to be justifiable should it be the only reasonable alternative to a greater deal of harm unto a greater number of people. In such a scenario, it could still be morally acceptable to engage in otherwise ethically discomforting actions in order to save lives and produce the best results for the greater number. That being said, in order to call one's actions morally right or justifiable under that maxim of ethics, to paraphrase the words of Aristotle, one must be able to reasonably apply ethical considerations to every decision in order to decide what would be most desirable given said circumstances. Applying moral wisdom to a situation or decision, even if the decision might otherwise be undesirable, might still result in a genuine moral course of action so long as moral virtues are utilized in choosing to act in a certain way. The failure of the actions of the U.S. government to uphold moral values in order to pursue their end goal does not mean that the U.S. must never engage in such actions if they are the only way to produce positive outcomes for the greatest number of those involved, and while a more reasonable attempt to consider the consequences of these actions and the use of moral wisdom when deciding to act is vital, this does not rob the making of difficult and morally complex decisions of its legitimate potential for good and moral righteousness.
First, let me say that our troops are handling a tough assignment in a very professional and truly outstanding way. They're doing a first-rate job. The allegations that have been made by many from comfortable distance that the men and women in the U.S. Armed Forces are somehow not properly treating the detainees under their charge are just plain false. These are fine, well-trained young men and women who are serving our country well, and it is a disservice to them to suggest anything to the contrary.